Good morning. I'm Raleigh Flynn, the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and we're very pleased this morning to have you join us for a discussion of China's influence on rare earths, a topic that I think doesn't get enough attention and has geoeconomic, geopolitical, and national security implications for the United States and for the world. Here to lead our discussion this morning, we have Dr. Julie Klinger from the University of Delaware. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Spatial Scientists at the University of Delaware, and she's also the author of Rare Earth Frontiers from Terrestrial Subsoils to Lunar Landscapes. We also have joining her our very own senior fellow, June Teufel Dreyer, as well as Dr. Saleem Ali, also from the University of Delaware. I'd like to welcome our FPRI friends and audiences, as well as the students and faculty of the University of Delaware. University of Delaware is a co-sponsor with FPRI of this series, and we are very grateful to them for their support. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. If you have questions, put them in the Q&A box, not the chat box, the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of my screen at least. So put your questions in there. About halfway through, we'll be turning to the questions of the audience. The chat box, on the other hand, if you have a technical problem, put your technical question in, or technical problem issue in the chat box, and we will try to help you. I know in the past we've had people had trouble getting logged on or seeing something, and they didn't tell us, and we really do try to help you. We'll also be including some maps as appropriate in the chat box, as well as some other information about our authors. And apparently there's a graduate certificate program at University of Delaware you'll be hearing more about, and we'll put a link to that in as well. We'll also be videotaping this, so if you miss part of it or want to share it with your friends and colleagues, by all means do that. It'll be available usually within 24 hours after the program. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Klinger.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here this morning as we talk about this really very important issue. So first off, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning in wherever you may be. So we're here to talk about rare earth elements, to understand China's role in the sector, and to explore and discuss the significance of all of this to the United States. So first, some basic stuff. The term rare earths refers to 17 elements. This includes the lanthanide series. If you can picture a periodic table of elements, that's that bar at the bottom, plus scandium and yttrium. Now, rare earths matter because their fantastic magnetic and conductive properties are essential to making the hardware and software of everyday life lighter and faster and stronger, and generally more effective. That means they're critical for medical, communications, information, transportation, and military technologies, and also for every form of energy generation, whether it's petroleum-based, nuclear, or renewable. So whether we require advanced medical therapy, such as MRI imaging or chemotherapy, or if we want to go to the moon or Mars, or simply build state-of-the-art technologies for work and for play in any sector, we need rare earth elements. Now, many of us know already that rare earths and critical minerals issues can really muddy the waters if we don't think about them clearly. So before we begin, and before we get into our discussion with our featured panelists today, I'd like to provide a little bit of a framework to help us think more clearly about the issues. So the first is this: it bears repeating until it's common knowledge. Most rare earth elements are not rare. Right? There's hundreds of potentially mineable deposits around the world. And so we have to ask, why are they called rare? Now here's your historical trivia for the day. When they were first discovered in Sweden in the late 1700s, no one had ever seen them before. And so they were erroneously assumed to be rare. And so outside of specialized audiences, and much to the lament of chemists and other scientists who work with these elements, the misnomer has stuck around. Now, many of the most commonly used rare earths are as abundant as copper or lead, but because mining, separating, and refining rare earths is energy and chemical intensive, from the 1980s onward, most of the rest of the world opted out of the dirty work of rare earth mining and value-added processing, right as China was opting in. So the fact that rare earths are overwhelmingly produced in China is not because we can't find them anywhere else. That's a really important point. The second point is that China's dominance in the rare earth sector is not a matter of mystery or conspiracy, right? As I detail in my book, which was based on several years of research in multiple continents and in multiple languages, this situation was an outcome of a confluence of policy decisions, some intentional, some unintentional, in China and the West, but nothing about our current challenge should really surprise us, because nothing that led us here was really a matter of secrecy, right? Various people have tried over the years to warn against exporting US industrial capacity while disinvesting in sustained research and development, but to little avail. Now, here's the point. Specific policy decisions did get us into this situation. And so the good news is that specific policy decisions are likely to get us out. And the reason for my qualified optimism here is that because the basic conditions are favorable to us, right? China's de facto monopoly is not due to the fact that China has the most rare earth reserves. Not only are mineable reserves abundant around the world, but currently less than 1% of rare earth bearing technologies and equipment that we consume are actually recycled. So in fact, by some estimates, there are years when the total volume of rare earths that are discarded is greater than what we actually consume. And so correcting this state of affairs is one comparatively easy way to reduce dependence and vulnerability. Now, since the beginning of the decade, China has published its intent to shift from being a net importer of rare earths, to being a net exporter of rare earths, to becoming a net importer of rare earths and a net exporter of value-added goods. So this is the predicament in which we find ourselves. The issue is not solely that the US is dependent on China for the refined elements, though that is also important. A very important issue is that the US is dependent on many of the technologies and technological components that contain rare earths. So if we export raw materials and import finished goods, we can expect a deepening trade deficit and greater dependence. So we are here today because this situation is neither sustainable nor responsible. We have a new Congress, a new president, and new opportunities to make important changes. So we can turn now to our panelists. So before introducing FPRI fellow Dr. Dreyer, I'd like to note that with us today is Dr. Saleem Ali. He's the Distinguished Blue and Gold Professor of Energy and Environment in the Department of Geography at the University of Delaware. And I would also like to note that he is a member of the United Nations Resources Panel and one of the authors of the November 2020 report entitled Technology Critical Elements and Their Relevance to the Global Environmental Facility, which is a background document provided by the Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel to the Global Environmental Facility under the United Nations Environment Program. Here at the University of Delaware, he's the program director for the Minerals, Materials, and Society program, which provides a graduate certificate and training and interdisciplinary training to scholars, policymakers, and industry professionals on these issues. It really is the first of its kind of its program in the country. So those of you that have questions with broader international dimensions of rare earths and other technology critical elements in mind are encouraged to ask them to Dr. Saleem Ali during the Q&A session. Following the interview and discussion, of course, with our featured panelist, Dr. June Teufel Dreyer, who I'm happy to introduce now. All right, so Dr. June Teufel Dreyer is a senior fellow in the Asia program at FPRI and a professor of political science at the University of Miami in Coral Gables in Florida. So she's formerly senior Far East specialist at the Library of Congress. She's also served as an Asia policy advisor to the Chief of Naval Operations and as Commissioner of the United States-China Economic and Security Review Commission. So Dr. Dreyer received her bachelor's from Wesley and an MA and PhD from Harvard. And she's the author of China's Political System, Modernization and Tradition, which is currently in its 10th edition, and many of us may have read ourselves. She's also the author of Middle Kingdom and Empire of the Rising Sun, Sino-Japanese Relations Past and Present, which is another important area of her expertise. And this was honored with the Japan Institute for National Fundamentals Award for the Best Book of the Year on Japan. Now, Dr. Dreyer has lectured widely in international fora, received numerous awards, and serves on the boards of editors of Orbis and Journal of Contemporary China. Her October piece, which was published on FPRI's website, called China's Monopoly on Rare Earth Elements and Why We Should Care, is the reason for our gathering here today. So June, your October piece was timely for several reasons. Right? First, the White House had recently issued an executive order declaring a national emergency in the mining industry aimed at incentivizing the domestic production of rare earths critical for military technologies while reducing American dependence on China. Your piece opened with a quote from the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, Ellen Lord, in her testimony to the Senate Armed Services Subcommittee on Readiness and Management Support. So in this quote that you provide as the opening to your article, Ms. Lord stated, quote, "A U.S. rare earth mineral strategy should consist of national stockpiles of certain rare earth elements, re-establishing rare earth mineral processing in the U.S. by implementing new incentives and removing disincentives, and research and development around new forms of clean rare earth mineral processing and substitutes. We will need your help." Now, a lot has happened on all fronts since October of the past year. Could you fill us in on any new important developments in this arena as of late?
Yeah, well, probably the most important one is that I assume, acting on Ellen Lord's succinct warning to do something and do it fast, the pandemic aid spending package that was signed by Trump last month included more than $800 billion to fund rare earth and strategic minerals research, with the specific charge that this was supposed to counteract China's dominance in the sector. So that is probably the most salient initiative that's been taken. And there are a number of subfacets in here. And whenever you start looking at a problem, as I know you did when you wrote your book, you find that it's connected to other things, which are then connected to other things, which are then connected to other things. And unless you can work on all of them simultaneously, you don't really have a viable solution. And one of those is how we reconcile better attention to creating a supply chain that does not include China, is can we make it commercially viable? And that's still a huge question mark. And also, can we do it without despoiling further Mother Earth, which we have been doing a good job of destroying in the last, I guess, 100 years, really. And so that's important. And then as we move away from fossil fuels, what does that do to communities that make their living through fossil fuels? And this is not only a problem in the United States, and you should all be thinking West Virginia here, but is also a huge, huge problem in China, which has very large coal reserves. And it's also very dirty coal. This is not anthracite. And there is a very large mining industry there. And these people live under the most ghastly conditions. China's coal mines are the most dangerous in the world, no question about it. And what happens to them? And if any of you have not seen the film Blind Shaft, Dr. Klinger is smiling. I take it you have seen it. Yeah, this is not a film to be viewed by the faint-hearted. It's pretty awful. And in the end, I at least sympathized with the villains in the film almost as much as I sympathized with the victims, because they're all in a very bad situation. And these are very tough guys. You don't become a miner in any field, rare earths or any other, unless you're pretty tough. And when you get a couple 100,000 people whose livelihoods have been negatively impacted by clean energy, you get a government that is already super worried about what they call social instability, to the edge of paranoia. So there's that aspect. And then global warming also comes into this. You may have noticed that a terrible, terrible flood of the Yangtze River this past summer. There were pictures in all the newspapers and on TV of people putting sandbags on the toes of the Lushan Buddha, which is this giant Buddha in Sichuan province. Now, Lushan happens to be also the home of a major rare earth processing facility. And although the Chinese government has not said anything about it, because the Chinese government does not say anything about things like this unless forced to, it is likely that a lot of the radioactive and other pollutant tailings of the rare earth extraction process ended up in the waters, the floodwaters of that river. So you have employment problems, you have downstream pollution problems, and you have problems of funding and access all coming together in a very unsavory way. And that's what we have to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you stated very well there the fact that any rare earths policy or strategy that we develop cannot be developed in isolation of these broader and cross-cutting factors. And so to that point, could I ask you, are there things that the US is currently doing specifically to alleviate anticipated shortage of supplies of rare earth elements?
To the best of my knowledge, we're just saying you need to do it. And we are hoping that private industry takes up the baton on this. And certainly they have. You and I were talking yesterday, and I said that there are a lot of pioneer mining companies that reacted, of course, very favorably to hearing about this $800 million kitty. And that was like watching a bunch of hungry cats having had a bowl of milk set down in front of them. So these are very bright people, and they are very incentivized people, but they haven't had a whole lot of time yet, since this just happened last month, to formulate plans. Not that they haven't been working on things like that this all along. The problem is, and I think this appears in one of your articles, Dr. Ali, that there is a considerable lag time between discovering where a rare earth concentration is and doing the exploration process, and then getting the relevant licenses and permits, and then eventually bringing it online. And I believe you mentioned 10 to 15 years. And so it's not like, okay, there's $800 million, now let's see your results. It's going to take a long time and a lot of hassles. A lot of this rare earth is in California, and I don't keep comparative statistics on this, but I do know that California is one of the most, if not the most, ecologically conscious states in the Union. And getting Mountain Pass up to speed on this is going to be very difficult. And another point to mention is that in order to get Mountain Pass out of bankruptcy, a lot of money was needed, and a good deal of that money came from China. And as a result, Mountain Pass sends its mined rare earths to China for processing, which is not quite what we had in mind when we said, let's create an independent supply chain. So there are many, many missteps and many, many steps yet to need to be taken. And we're Americans and we believe in the value of technology, and we are certainly working on it. And would you be interested in hearing some of the things we've accomplished?
I think that's really important. You know, when we talk about the challenges, you know, confronting us in the rare earth sector, it is also important to take stock of, you know, the work that's been done thus far. So if you could please enumerate some of the accomplishments, that would be great.
First, let's start out by saying we're not really sure. We know that there's going to be a greater demand for rare earth components. That's not a question. Predicting, for reasons Dr. Ali has already mentioned in his work, is going to be difficult to say exactly how much. There was a report that came out on December 26th of this past year that said within the next couple of years, the demand for rare earths is expected. Now notice, expected does not mean it's going to happen exactly that way. Expected to exceed supply by 40,000 tons a year unless we develop major new production sources. Now, as Dr. Klinger has said, those sources do exist, and we have a fairly good idea where they are, but that doesn't solve the problems really. I noticed that Australia, that mine in Australia, Linus, L-Y-N-U-S, so not like the guy in Peanuts cartoon, they mine the ore in Australia, and then they ship it to Malaysia for processing. And I have heard nothing about the pollutants that are entering Malaysia through the Linus's processing facility, but I do know that there's a major question in Malaysia going on right now because a Chinese businessman is hoping to invest a lot of money in a rare earth facility. And the Malaysian Prime Minister is very concerned about this, as is the government of the state in Malaysia, Perak, where it's happening. Now, about these technology fixes, there is, let me see, I've got its exact name written down here. There is in the United States government a National Energy Technology Laboratory. It's under the US Department of Energy, and it has been funding a project at the University of West Virginia, which obviously is a big coal state, and to extract economically and strategically important rare earth elements, REEs, from Appalachian coal, which is a wonderful idea. And the report, this is a very new report, came out on the 8th of this month, is said to have reached new milestones, like in partial automation of the recovery process. In other words, we don't have to have so many humans mucking around in it, and also managed to exceed its percentage of purity. So, and so that's a good start from technology, and hopefully this project at West Virginia University will get some of that 800 million and use it productively. And by the way, as of 2013, just to add to what Dr. Klinger said earlier, according to Molycorp, less than 1% of the rare earths that are consumed are subsequently recycled. So we've got to be able to do better at that. And Molycorp's research, again back to technology, has shown that acid mine drainage, it's called AMD, acid mine drainage in the jargon, precipitates from mining sites can be transformed into revenue streams for local businesses and technology. In other words, you can produce things there that are saleable. And they use a new method of acid leaching solvent extraction. And again, there's a jargon word for that too, ALSX. And it's now been partially automated. Again, fewer humans being exposed to toxic things. And if I can put in a push for Julie Klinger's book, you have some really frightening scenes there of things you actually saw in Bayan Obo in Inner Mongolia. And so this gives you some clue as to what more automation could hope to achieve. And so we hope that further automation will improve performance, reduce pollution to humans at least, and lower costs. And we also have reports that Japanese scientists are working on ways to extract rare earths from mine tailings. These things that mine tailings are the ore waste of mines. And they're typically very muddy and a major environmental issue. I have a photograph somewhere of some poor soul from a mine in Guangzhou in southern China, carting an enormous bucket of slop. It's the tailings waste, and he's covered in it himself. And these are shown to be radioactive. So any way we can reduce that is all to the good. Now, 2 years ago, now it's almost 3 years ago, Toyota announced it had developed a new magnet for electric motors that could reduce the use of neodymium magnets for up to 50%, and eliminate the use of terbium and dysprosium entirely. Dysprosium is extremely expensive. If you've read my little article for the FPRI, you notice that somebody compared extracting dysprosium to killing a steer just for the sirloin. And I thought that was a terrific metaphor. And so now, according to Toyota, you can substitute lanthanum and cerium, they're both rare earths, but they're cheap rare earths compared to dysprosium. And you can substitute them for neodymium, and they're still get high heat resistance and coercivity, in other words, push power from this. Other new developments, this one's from a Canadian company, Medallion Resources, and with a US partner, and it's developed, again, very recently, what they say is a safe, sustainable, and low-cost extraction and production process using monazite. And monazite is a high-grade phosphate mineral that contains up to 60% REEs, rare earth elements, and it's easily available. We've got lots of it. And furthermore, it's a byproduct of operations in North American, Australian, and African mineral sands operators. So it's out there and it's cheap. Dr. Klinger's book also mentioned that Brazil had made great strides using recycled water from mining operations to produce rare earth oxides in ways that reduce their overall waste footprint. And now, another problem here, the supply and demand is that they're clean technologies we're all trying to get so that we can get carbon neutrality by 2035, we hope. Use things, entail operations that use a lot of rare earth elements. And this is going to compound the problem. A EV, electric vehicle, uses something like 9 times as many rare earths as a combustion engine, which uses rare earths in this catalytic converter. Wind turbines use enormous amounts of rare earth elements. B-35s, F-35s, our newest fighter planes, again, multiples of what earlier planes did, and Virginia class submarines, again, multiple numbers of times of rare earths. Now, at the same time, China it's not running out of rare earths, but its growing concern with environmental problems, and it is a huge concern, is inducing it to export less rare earths. So even taking off the possibility of an embargo off the table, and I would not take it off the table, but even if you do take it off the table, you can expect China to export less rare earths, because a leader in the EV field is going to be China. I guess arguably it already is, and certainly Japanese car makers, who are also very at the forefront of this field, are feeling the heat, if you will, from Chinese manufacturers. So Chinese are at the same time getting more environmentally, I should say very carefully here, the Chinese government is getting more environmentally conscious, because the average Chinese consumer is not, and there are all kinds of ways around the rules. But they are apt to be using more of those rare earths for their own purposes, as well as becoming more concerned about the environment. So both of those feed into less available supplies from China. And I found a 2011 study from China saying that in remember, this is 9.5 years ago, in southern China, there had already been permanent loss of ecosystems and severe e-soil erosion and air pollution and biodiversity loss, and a lot of human health problems. Now, where does this leave us? I think with a huge problem, and I think that's really, these plans are wonderful. If you're going to bring them to fruition, you're going to have close cooperation between our private sector, which has come up with some wonderful ideas, our scientists, who again have come up with some wonderful ideas, and the government. And there is the current buzz phrase is what we want is a mine to magnet supply chain. I like that phrase. And how do we get there? Here, there's been a very interesting proposal by it is Marco Rubio, my own senator here from Florida, and he has proposed a co-op operation between private and public. He says, and I think this is a wise caveat, that he wants, let me start back, he wants a federal charter for a domestic rare earth metallurgy cooperative. And he sees this as a privately funded and managed utility. He is a conservative Republican after all, that could allow technology and manufacturing. And as a cooperative, it would allow competing industries to work together. That's keeping fingers crossed kind of thing, and operate on a cost basis, thus being shielded from price manipulation by China. Rubio, for those who don't know, is a sino-skeptic. And it could function as a utility, which I think is a very interesting idea, which is available for use by non-member companies upstream and downstream in the value chain. We have here in my department a public administration master's program with some very, very good people in it. And I consulted them and they say, yes, it's possible. and they know of places it actually works, not for rare earths, but if it does work for electricity grid sharing and other things, it can work for this. But finally, and this is my closing remark, I can tell it's time for Q&A. We have to get used to the idea that at least at the level of technology we're at now, and keep your fingers crossed, this might not be true in a few years, there's no such thing as a commercially feasible supply chain. And either the US taxpayer, in order to get that China-free supply chain, either the US taxpayer subsidizes the rare earth industry, or we rely on China, which has lower wages and already subsidizes its rare earth industry. And just as one further caveat, and I was thinking about this just yesterday because of a new report by Danny Roderick, the world famous economist, and he says, he's talking here about the EU, but this applies to rare earths as well. A fundamental question in concluding agreements with China that's relevant here to rare earths is, can democracies stay true to their values while engaging in trade and investment with China? And how should strategic and economic relations between major powers with very different institutional and political arrangements be managed? In other words, we are horrified by what's going on in Xinjiang. We are horrified by what has happened in Hong Kong and is still happening in Hong Kong. How should that affect our investments and our trade relations, given the fact that rare earth elements are useful? And I leave you with that.
Right, thank you so much, Dr. Dreyer. That's a really excellent and thought-provoking closing statement there. Before we do open it up for questions, I'd like to invite Dr. Saleem Ali to comment on any of the array of issues that we've covered here thus far.
Thank you very much, Dr. Klinger, and really insightful comments from Dr. Dreyer, particularly the contemporary technology commentary was most impressive, as well as the recommendations for concrete action, such as those from Senator Rubio. So just a few comments around the waste issue, I think, which is coming up also in the chat, and I've been trying to respond to some of the comments in the chat. You know, the ultimate goal for us as environmental planners should be moving towards a circular economy where we have material flows and we make waste essentially obsolete as much as possible, though there are physical constraints to that with the second law of thermodynamics, but as much as possible, we try to minimize waste. So when we talk about tailings and extraction of rare earth minerals from tailings, that should be a priority for sure, because there are many mines all over the world, including in the US. We've had a long history of uranium mining, particularly in the Southwest, but also in other parts of the country, where it's possible to extract some rare earth minerals from the tailings. In Australia, that is something the government has been increasingly supportive of. And I've spent quite a bit of my career in Australia as one of my other countries of citizenship too. And that's something that the US has been missing. The level of public sector engagement which is there in Australia around the extractive industries, public-private partnerships, it hasn't been upscaled in the US to the same degree. So that's another policy aspect we should consider. So for example, scandium is another important technology metal, and there has been an effort in Australia to try and extract it from an old uranium mine in Queensland. So, but that has been supported by the Queensland government. You know, it hasn't quite reached to the point where it's commercially viable yet, but if scandium prices reach a certain point, it may well be that that's something that could be pursued. The other aspect of waste that we have to consider, and this is, with waste, it's a sort of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, it's a resource where you can extract materials from, but on the other hand, it's a stigma from the environmental point of view, saying something is a waste, it's potentially going to be causing harm. And so at times, environmentalists use the term waste to stigmatize the resource so that they can shut down an industry. So this is the real challenge we have, is if we label everything as waste, there are certain regulatory pressures whereby then the waste cannot be used. So we have within the US regulatory system, for example, the RCRA, which is the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, some of those regulations, if you make the waste so difficult to harness in terms of useful material from it, then you prevent a circular economy from functioning. So you kind of, environmentalists have to be very careful that they do not push the envelope in terms of labeling something as hazardous waste, particularly where you can't even extract material usefully. This is the challenge Linus has been facing in Malaysia, and I visited that site. I've spent time, like Julie, I've also visited Bayanobo, and some of these rare earth sites, they're definitely very scary and they've got a lot of issues. But in terms of the thorium waste, particularly from the rare earth site in Malaysia, the radioactivity content is actually very low. And as someone who has a background in chemistry and then has further degrees in the social sciences and public policy, I'm just dispassionately evaluating it in that way. But because there was such a strong activism against that site itself from being situated in Malaysia, and it became more of a situation where it was Australia versus Malaysia. Why are the Australians sending their processing to us? Why don't they set it up there? It unfortunately became framed in that way. But if you look at the actual radiation content, it's very low. And in many cases, that same material could be used as road filler. So it's better to store that and see whether it can be used safely later. One of the points I raised is with thorium, there is a movement to try and develop thorium reactors in the future. And the reason why that's important is that if we actually move down the road, maybe 20 years down the road towards thorium reactors, we wouldn't even need to mine uranium for the conventional nuclear reactors, because we have enough waste material from which we could have the nuclear fuel be sourced. Now that's where the investment should go. People say, well, we didn't develop them in the past and that shows the thorium technology is useless. I tend to disagree. There were military industrial reasons for developing conventional nuclear reactors with uranium, because you had plutonium generated as a side product, which was needed by the defense establishment. So there was a bias towards developing those kinds of reactors. If we really invested in thorium reactors, we would have a way forward. So that's sort of looking at it from a systems perspective on future energy generation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Ali. So now, with the remaining time that we have, we're going to go to the Q&A. Thank you so much to all of you for maintaining a vibrant side conversation in the chat. Let's see if we can address some of those questions now.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. An interesting discussion, and it has clearly provoked a lot of questions, and so I'll do my best to get to as many as possible. From Jerry Rubenstein, we have a question. One would assume that China is the low-cost producer of rare earths. It is difficult to compete in a commodity if you are not the low-cost producer. Without government subsidies, what would attract private capital to invest in rare earth production in the US? Maybe this is for June.
Well, June thinks she has actually mentioned that, in the sense that unless there are government subsidies, it's not going to happen. And we are also much more environmentally concerned. It is not that corruption doesn't happen here, but corruption doesn't happen on the scale it happens in China. So in China, you pass a regulation and it may or may not be obeyed. The This is a very common saying in China, speaking to the central government, 你有政策，我有对策. You have a policy, I have a counter policy. And we see this in the Burmese government. They said, we don't want to send rare earths to you anymore. And so a lot of corruption went around, and the rare earths are now shipped through a leaky border with bribable border guards into Yunnan and back around again. And I know that this happens because I read it in Julie's book, that it happens in Bayan Obo as well, that you mentioned multiple levels of what was it, inspection, and that the state-owned enterprises do not have to send their environmental information to the mineral industry. They send it to SASAC instead, the State Asset Securities Control Commission or whatever it is, and which takes a very different view. And so this is going to be a problem everywhere. We have in the United States, and by the way, I was thrilled to see a mention of this in your book, Julie. You mentioned that the U.S. Security and Economic Review Commission complained that the Treasury Department was always chaired CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investments in the United States. That was my phrase in that report. And it was not just my idea. We had it from testimony from, N+1 people. So there are always ways around things. And, but at present, even though China has become very ecologically conscious, it's still the lowest cost place to get your rare earths processed. And unless we are really serious about these subsidies, and my concern here is that as Americans, we tend to not think about problems until they become crises and then try to remedy them. And that is what we have been doing with rare earths for a long, long time. Back in 1970s, the concern among rare earth specialists was the Soviet Union, not China. And okay, no more Soviet Union, no more problem. Oh gosh, China might be a problem. And now we get back to it. And we have a tendency to say, let's worry about the current problem and not this one too often. And so we need more sustained attention as well as those government subsidies.
A couple questions at the end, and it sounds like a lot of this, the issues are around policy. And I would ask, are any of you aware of a Biden administration position on these issues? And is there bipartisan support for the Rubio proposal? I would also, in addition to looking at US policies on this, we have a question at the very beginning. One of the first questions is extraction, monopolized use of rare earths by China acceptable under international law? And that points to me the question, is there any hope of having any kind of effective enforceable policies or international regulations, cooperation internationally to govern and monitor the use and extraction?
Well, on the international side, maybe I can comment because of my United Nations role. There is currently a resolution with the UN Environment Assembly, which is a body of all the world's environment ministers and natural resource ministers, that focuses on mineral governance, that we should have some kind of global standards around environmental and social performance of minerals. There are a lot of voluntary standards that companies can ascribe to their certification systems for particular metal supply chains. But there is no international treaty on mineral governance. And that is something that has been suggested. It's something which I have written about also in a few articles, that it deserves to be considered, not just from the environmental and social side, which is very important, but also from a resource security point of view for a carbon transition. If we really are serious about meeting the targets of the Paris Agreement, we need to have some consensus on how are we going to resource the infrastructure which is needed for meeting the Paris Agreement. You know, we cannot just meet the Paris Agreement with current infrastructure just by reducing. If we have to switch from coal to something else, we have to build the infrastructure of what that is, whether that is solar, wind, or nuclear, or other hydropower, and so on. And so where that will come from will require some coordination. And currently we have absolutely no coordination on that. So that's something which I have suggested at the next Glasgow meeting, in the COP meeting on climate change, the Conference of the Parties, that should be discussed.
And if I could speak to the national level policy, I think one of the important things to remember here is that when we're talking about the policy gaps currently in the US, we don't have to come up with an entirely new toolkit. Right? In sectors as diverse as agriculture and aerospace, the US government has a history of investing in multiple points along the supply chain in order to get an industry off its feet. Right? And so what we're proposing here, and what many of us are saying is needed, is not radical by US standards. And I think another thing to point out is, you know, the MP materials facility out in Mountain Pass, California, over the past couple of years, you know, in compliance with environmental regulations, they've developed a water recycling process and acid-free separations technique, which significantly reduces the environmental footprint and liabilities. And so our challenge is not necessarily where do we, you know, how do we build this entirely new policy apparatus in order to, say, beat China? Our challenge is more, how do we restore and rebuild a comprehensive rare earths or mine to magnet supply chain to support development and innovation in the US. And from this, for this, we can look to many other sectors for useful guidance. To address the question as to whether we see a position in the incoming administration, actually we haven't seen anything new yet, but I think that with the bipartisan initiatives which have already been mentioned in this call, we can expect to see some momentum along these lines. But so we don't run into the disappointments that we've encountered periodically over the past decade, I think it is up to academic policy and industry community to keep this item at the top of the agenda going forward.
Just a quick, just a quick point on the Biden administration. There is a position that has just been announced yesterday within the Department of Defense. There's going to be a role for energy and environment. The person they've appointed is Richard Kidd, who is, I think, very capable in this regard. So there is now at least one person who's going to have this purview within Department of Defense, which is interesting. And part of that portfolio may link in with also what was done in the State Department during the Trump administration, which was the Energy Resource Governance Initiative, which was dealing with some of these issues of resource security. So there may be potential.
But we've got momentum, it seems to me, on this issue. And as Dr. Klinger said, it's up to us in the interested policy community to push this thing forward. I do think there's bipartisan support for this.
We have a question from former Congressman Toby Moffett, who asks, since isn't it obvious that we'll never be able to create a US only supply chain, even though we might increase the mining of rare earths and processing of them in the US? If that's true, why aren't we looking at creating some kind of compacts with countries in the developing world, especially Africa, that could provide a supply of rare earths for processing in the US?
Well, the Chinese are already very active in Uganda among other places. So we're kind of late there. And if you deal with African countries, you're going to come across this human rights issue again, since many of these countries are not exactly ruled by the kind of democratic governments we're comfortable with. And you can expect US human rights groups to get very exercised about that kind of cooperation. So it's not as simple as it looks.
There is, I should mention, under the Pompeo State Department, this Energy Resource Governance Initiative, which was launched, that includes Botswana as one of the countries. So it's a consortium of 5 countries which would get together and help with providing alternative supply sources to China. And the 5 countries were the US, Canada, Australia, Botswana, and Peru. Those are the 5 currently. So that gets at perhaps the question. But the only 2 developing countries in there are Botswana and Peru. And Botswana is not quite a developed, it's one of the wealthiest countries per capita in Africa. So, you know, the bigger questions are, for example, cobalt, which is not one of the rare earth metals, but 70% of the supply comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. You know, where will be alternative supplies to those kinds of metals too?
A question from Jennifer Hinton. Can you comment further on the potential implications of one country essentially controlling the rare earths and resulting control over technology, including those used in defense, green technologies, etc.? And given your final remarks, what provisions do you believe should be put in place to attract, incentivize, and increase the commercial feasibility of rare earth supply chains that are independent of China? In terms of trade-offs, including environmental, do you believe this is something that should favor measures that are not necessarily focused on financial returns?
Well, what can I say? I completely agree. And I think that nobody has any problem with a consortium involving Australia and Canada and perhaps Japan. And something I didn't get a chance to mention, that is, about 5 years ago now, the Japanese found off Minare Torijima, which means Southern Tory Island, in the Japanese economic zone, exclusive economic zone, all the rare earths they would need for until kingdom come. And the problem is developing the technology to get it out. I think nobody would have a problem with Japan as a member of that consortium, or Japan controlling a substantial amount of that supply. So it can be done. And we do have good relations, technological interchange relations with the Japanese, some of which we can talk about and some of which we can't. But the conduits, let me say, are there.
We are just about at the end of our time, unfortunately, and a lot of unanswered questions, but I'd like to do just a quick round for our panelists for final words to sum up, or any last comments.
One point I would make on the alternative sources, which are relatively close to the US, a major potential is Greenland. Greenland has several rare earth mining exploration projects that are potentially quite advanced for production. We don't know the full details yet, but it's one to keep an eye on, and one where there is a lot of investment going in. I would also say then that overall, you know, we don't want to make this in the long run into a situation where US-China relations are seen to be completely irreconcilable. I personally think that ultimately China and the US have to get along. And there is such tight coupling that we don't want this to go towards a permanent divorce. So we have to find some opportunities for convergence where there is resilience built into supply chains, but where we are not making it a completely zero-sum game.
June?
I can't disagree with that. The Greenland case is very complicated. because Greenland is only semi-sovereign, and the Danish government is very, very worried about what is happening there. The United States is very, very worried about what's happening there. We have a major air base at Toefl, and that is also the convergence of what I call the Yuk Gap. It's Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom, which is a way to monitor Soviet submarines coming through to Europe. And together, NATO and the Danes and the United States are going to watch this very carefully. This is a very sticky issue because I read and there are various publications from the Arctic. Why, I don't know, but it's fun. And one of them recently said, "Whose Arctic is this anyway?" And they are, reacting to China saying we're a near Arctic state, and the United Pompeo saying there's no such thing as a near Arctic state. There are Arctic states and non-Arctic states. And so Greenland is saying, keep out of it, guys. And I do think that this is worth looking at very carefully because there are a lot of nuances here, and we are going to have to show some respect for Greenland in the autonomous part of their semi-autonomous state, and hope they can be brought around to the idea that they would be better off in a partnership with Australia, United States, and Japan than they would be with China. And I think we can do it.
Thank you, June. Julie.
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out that while these tensions between the US and China have periodically flared up over the issue of rare earth elements, scientific and technical cooperation has continued. And so one thing that I think it's important for us to remember is that there are actually a lot of common challenges when it comes to building a resilient and diversified global rare earth supply chain. And that, yes, we do need to address our immediate national security concerns around supply chain security, but we also should not forget, ignore, or overlook the expertise that's been developed on the part of US and Chinese counterparts working together over the decades to drive research, development, and innovation in this sector. And so I think the other thing to keep in mind here is that the US and China are the world's two most interdependent economies. And maybe that helps explain some of the tensions that we have here. But the policy tools that we need to address domestic supply chain security they're already tried and true in other sectors. And so we can take and apply and move forward together.
With apologies to those whose questions we didn't have time to get to, we have to say goodbye. Thank you again to our panelists, Julie, June, Saleem, and thank you to the University of Delaware for co-hosting this event. It's part of our new First State Series, and we'll be doing at least a couple more events this spring, I believe. And so stay tuned for those announcements. And thank you again to our FPRI supporters and our board members who are on the call. Thank you and stay safe.